Hello and welcome to the Custom CSS and Divi Beginner Guide. So if you're here, chances are you already know that you want to learn CSS. You want to be able to confidently follow different Divi tutorials that require use of CSS without hoping it will work. And you would like to maybe simply have a better understanding on how to work with CSS when building websites using the Divi theme. If that sounds good, this video is for you. Hi, my name is Ania and my goal here is to help you build beautiful websites. So this video guide is for all CSS beginners who would like to start modifying their Divi websites in more advanced ways. We will talk about the structure of a CSS language, where you can put your custom CSS code in Divi, what are CSS classes and IDs, and what tools you might find helpful in your adventure with CSS. So let's get started. I promised to make this beginner friendly, so we're starting at the beginning. What is CSS? CSS actually stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is a coding language that is used for styling and designing the layout of a website. So CSS handles the way a website looks, while HTML, another coding language, is primarily responsible for the content, the structure of the website. When you're using Divi to design your websites, you are also using HTML and CSS, although not directly. When you're adding a new section, row, or a module in the Divi builder, you're creating the HTML structure. And when you use various design settings, Builder generates the corresponding CSS code. CSS is a logical language, and as soon as you understand the rules, you will find it easy to read and analyze. So first, let's start with the CSS syntax. Let's take a look at the basic CSS rule set structure. Rule set is a complete unit of code instruction, a sentence, if you will. It contains information about the element you want to target, the properties you want to modify, and the values you want to apply. So first we have CSS selector. After the selector, we have opening and closing curly brackets. Inside the brackets, we have our declarations. It can be one declaration, like here in this example, or multiple declarations. Each declaration is a property and value pair, followed by a semicolon. So there are many different ways we can construct CSS selectors, which will target different elements on our sites. But at the beginning of your CSS journey, you can focus on elements, classes, and IDs. Now, in order to define CSS selectors, we need to understand a little bit of HTML. So before we go into Divi, let's have a look at the sample HTML structure. I have a couple of containers, a div with a class myText, another one, that one also has ID special, and inside each of these divs there's a heading level 2, a paragraph of text. I also have h2 with a class subtitle, paragraph with a class subtitle. So you can target elements just by using the tag name. Okay, so here is an example. Let me remove that comment. Now I have three CSS declarations: border width, 3 pixels, border style, solid, and border color, this hex code. I could replace all these three with single declaration, a shorthand for border, 3 pixel. So that line of CSS will do exactly the same thing as these three. Okay, so let's stick with just one. And now I'm targeting all H2 throughout my HTML structure. So I have H2 here and 3 additional H2s here. So 4 elements get that orange border. Now, another way to target an element is by using a class. So instead of H2, let's use the subtitle class. And now I'm targeting any element with a class subtitle. So in my HTML structure, I have H2 with a class subtitle and P with a class subtitle. Both will have that border. So if I want to be more specific, I can combine the tag name with a class to only target H2 with a class subtitle. Now the P is no longer selected. So that selector selects every H2 with a class subtitle. So to select a class, we are using dot, and there cannot be any space here if that's to target one element. We can also use IDs to target things. So instead of H2 subtitle, let's target ID special. And now that second div with a class myText and ID special has that additional border. So the difference between IDs and CSS classes is that ID should be unique, can be used only once per page, and element can have only one ID, while CSS classes can be used multiple times on multiple elements, and even in addition to that, an element can have more than one CSS class. So it could be myText, box, module. We could have multiple CSS classes on one element, while there can only be one ID. Another difference that is important in CSS between the class and ID is that ID has more specificity value, meaning because CSS is cascading language, and that means that if, for example, my text CSS class div would have a border, and then further down the page we would target that again with a different border color, for example, the second rule set will take place because that's cascading style sheets. But if there is an ID somewhere before that final declaration, so if we have another declaration that targets ID special, now this will override that CSS because ID target is more specific than a class target. So now that middle myText div, even though the final declaration has that purple color, is actually orange because here we are using ID to target it. Now we can combine all three together. So instead of, let's remove that for a moment, I could be very specific and target a div with ID special and a class myText. So all these together will apply only to that particular element, but notice there is no spaces here. So when there's no spaces, it applies to one element. But if we use a space, because you will see space in your selectors many times, so space is used to define parent and children elements. So for example, if I would like to target H2 inside my myText element, that H2 doesn't have any class or ID, right? If I just use H2 selector, I'm targeting all H2s. But I don't want to target this one. I want to target only the ones that are inside that myText container. So I can use myText CSS class as a parent and then use a space in between two. And now only the h2s inside the container with a class myText are selected. I could use that special ID here. And now only h2 inside the container with ID special is being selected. So that is an important symbol, space. It's how you can define parent containers when selecting something. Now, another useful character you should be aware of is comma, because with comma we can specify multiple targets. So let's say I want to target that h2 and also that first one with a class subtitle. So h2 class subtitle. And now these two are selected. Comma means that we are separating two different elements. First, we are selecting this and also this with all these CSS properties listed inside, all the declarations listed inside that particular rule set. Okay, so these are examples of basic ways to define CSS selectors, and I am not going to go in depth explaining different CSS properties. Most of the CSS property names have a semantic meaning, so you immediately know what it does, like border color, background color, font size, and so on. So I would encourage you to explore on your own, and if you check our blog post with the CSS beginner guide, we are listing some useful resources for further learning. But okay, you know how CSS looks. Now let me show you how Divi generates that code for us. So here I have a text module, and let's say I want to add a right border here to that module. So left border. Border left 3 pixels and that purple color. Let's also add some spacing here. So left padding 20 pixels. Okay, now if I save that and I have that page opened here, let's refresh. Now, to see the CSS and also the HTML, basically to inspect your website, I am going to use the Chrome inspector. So it's just right click and inspect, and it's right here in your browser. And to check that particular element, we can select that. So using that arrow here. And now we can click on that element, and it gets selected here in the HTML preview, and I can see that this is a div with multiple classes. It has ETPB with border, ETPB module, ETPB text, ETPB text1, and so on. Multiple CSS classes are added to that element, and below I see all CSS declarations that are affecting that element in some way. So I can immediately see that there is that ETPB text1 target with border left width 3 pixels, border left color, and padding left. So all the things that I've chosen in the design settings, Divi Builder generated that CSS code for me. Okay, so that is CSS generated by Divi, but as you know, sometimes the builder's design settings are not enough, and we need to use our own CSS code. So how can we add our own CSS to a Divi website? And you can start right here in the inspector. So find an element you want to target. Let's say I want to add that border to that h2 inside that first module. Okay, so I want to target that h2, and I also want to add a left border just like we did for that module here. So this module uses a class of ETPB text0. So similarly to what Divi generated for that second one, for this one, ETPB text1, we can use ETPB text0 class. By using that plus icon here, I can add a new CSS rule set. and I can define my own target. So etp_btext0 is a class of my parent container, and inside I want to target h2. And let's say I want to add border left 3 pixels, solid purple. Okay, so there's that border right here. Now let's also add some padding. Padding left 20 pixels, something like that, or maybe 10, okay? Let's also add some top padding. So padding left 10 and padding. Okay, now I have my CSS. I can see that it works here for that heading inside that element, and inspector created that temporary inspector style sheet for me. So I can come in here and copy that CSS code, and now back on my page, I can add that to my page settings. Okay, so here in the page settings, advanced custom CSS, we can add that CSS rule set, and we can see that it immediately works right there. Okay, now the problem with using, let's save that. The problem with using a CSS class like this is that number is generated automatically. Now, if I were to move that section here, for example, now this is the first text module on my page, and now the CSS I wrote only affects this one and not the one I wanted, right? So instead of using that numbered class, I can add my own CSS class to a module. So let's add a CSS class of my border. And now for my page settings, custom CSS, let's change that etp_btext0 to my border. And now anytime I want to add a border to an h2, I can add a my border CSS class to the parent container. So in this case, a text module. If I want to add that border here as well, all I need to do is add a CSS class of my border. Okay, so page settings is the first place you would want to add your CSS code this way, but that CSS code will only work on that particular page. But if I want to use that same my border CSS class everywhere on my website, it would be better to place that CSS not here. So let's save that and add that in Divi theme options custom CSS box right here. And this way, that CSS added here in the custom CSS will be loaded on every page of the site. So here I'm back on that page. Let's refresh. And now I have these two text modules with that CSS class, and that border is added from my custom CSS added in the theme options. Now this theme options custom CSS box is actually the same one as we can see in the theme customizer. So either one would be fine. Here in the Divi theme customizer, additional CSS, you see we have that same CSS code. So we could change the color, for example. And now let's see if it changes the border color. Okay, so that's the same code now. If I refresh my theme options, it's being changed. So that's the same box. It's just accessible from two different places. So that CSS will load globally on every page of your site. It will work the same way as CSS added inside your child theme style sheet. Okay, so if you want to learn more about child themes and when you might want to use it, because that is my preferred way. So instead of theme options, I would go to Appearance, Theme File Editor, and add my CSS here. And it that's my method for adding custom CSS for two reasons. I tend to write a lot of CSS. So if you have a few hundred lines of code, this little box in the theme options, it's not very convenient to work with. So using a style sheet, in addition to have more space for your code, it also opens up the possibility to edit your website CSS directly inside the code editor, not through the browser. So if you open that file through FTP, for example, but that's not all of the ways we can work with CSS in Divi. There are two additional places where you can use custom CSS in Divi that I would like to discuss. So first, a code module. If you want to use a code module to add your CSS, let's add a code module here, for example, that CSS needs to be wrapped inside the HTML style tag. So opening style tag and closing style tag, and then your CSS can go in between here. Now, using code modules for CSS is useful if you would like to export your page layout and you're using some CSS for that page that you would like to export as well. Because adding CSS here in your page settings, custom CSS, this will not get exported if you use that import-export portability feature. So that's the only way to include that custom CSS is with the code module. I use that also when saving sections to Divi Cloud. If the section uses some custom styling, I would add it. I would add in the code module inside. The CSS would go to the code module, and then when I decide to use that section on a different website, I can load it from the Divi Cloud and then copy the CSS from the code module back to my style sheet to keep everything in one place. So one last place Divi allows you to add CSS is inside the settings panel for all the builder elements. In each section, row, columns inside rows, and each module, you will see a custom CSS section in the advanced tab. So it comes at least with 3 different boxes, 2 for pseudo elements, before and after, and 1 for the main element, the main container for this, in this case, text module. Some modules will have additional boxes which you can use to target different parts within these modules, but for text we only have these. And the main difference here is that the CSS selector, our target, is already defined by the builder. If you click that question mark icon here, the builder will show you that CSS added here will target the following class, etpbtext1. So builder is showing you the selector that's going to be used. And again, this would be safe because it changes dynamically for us. If I move that module somewhere else or add additional text modules, that number will change dynamically, and custom CSS I add here will use that correct number. So inside that box, you only need to add your declarations. So you can imagine opening and closing bracket here, and then inside we only need our properties and values. So instead of writing the whole rule set, we only use that in what's inside the bracket. So border left 3 pixel solid purple, something like that, and then padding left 20 pixels. Now the main limitation is that predefined target. If I would like to target only my H2 inside that text module, it's not possible from here. The target needs to be different, just like the one we started with. To target H2, I would need to target etpbtext1 space H2. But here I can only target the whole container. So let me just quickly show you how it works with blurbs. So I have 4 blurbs modules here, and let's say, let's look in the advanced custom CSS. We have before, after, the main element, and we also have blurb image, blurb title, and blurb content. So what if I would like to add a border around that content right here? The blurb content says that it will add CSS to ETPB blurb 2 ETPB blurb content inside. There is a space here, so it will target the container with a class ETPB blurb content, which is inside ETPB blurb 2. Let's add border 3 pixels solid orange, and that's actually wrapping the whole container. That ETPB blurb content is that whole content. It's not the content of the it's not just my paragraph of text with a heading. So let's see how I would need to see what is this container I want to target and how I can apply that CSS code. So I will use that border, the same border, but first I will add my own CSS class. So let's go with blurb, my blurb, okay? So let's save that. And now if I refresh, and again, right click, inspect, I want to find what is the container that holds my text and paragraph of text, because I don't want to target the whole thing, just the text inside. So inside my module, the blurb module, I have ETPB blurb content, the container that was listed in the Divi settings, and inside I have main blurb image, and also ETPB blurb container, H4, and description. Maybe I would only want to target the description and leave out the heading. So description is the thing that I want to target. Now I will add a new rule set, but I don't want to target all blurb descriptions throughout entire website. I want to be more specific. That's why I added my custom CSS class of my blurb. And you see that CSS class is right here on the one of the parent containers. So my blurb is outside container, and then I'm using a space, and I'm targeting ETPB blurb description. And let's add that border and also some padding. So padding, just padding without top right, bottom left, will target all of the values. We can apply padding to everything at once. So right now, if I would like to use that CSS, again, I can copy it from here, paste that to my style sheet, for example, update the file, and now I'm refreshing the page, and my border is added to that blurb element. If I would like to use that border on each of these blurb, I have two choices. I could either add that CSS class to each of the blurbs here, right? But I could also add that CSS class to my row, because it will target all blurb description containers, all ETPB blurb description inside my blurb CSS class. So if instead of here, here, my blurb, if I go to row settings or even section settings, since I clicked that one, so in the section settings, advanced, custom CSS classes, my blurb. Now if I refresh, I didn't refresh that page, but if I save that and now refresh on the front end, every blurb container within that section will have that CSS class. So I could either add it to the blurb as well if I want to be very specific, or if I know that inside this section and I only have these types of blurbs that I want to have that border here, then I can add that CSS class to my section as well. And if I refresh the page here, it will also work in the builder. Okay, so I think we covered most of the basics of how Divi handles custom CSS, all of the different ways we can add our own code inside a Divi site. I hope this explanation was helpful. And you know, I have to mention this, once or twice a year, I'm organizing a fun online event, completely free, 1 week Divi and CSS challenge, where we learn the CSS foundations, targeting and troubleshooting CSS with daily video lessons and live Q&As. So we always have so much fun. So if that sounds like a good thing you would want to join, check out the links below the video in the description and join our waitlist so you don't miss the next CSS challenge. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, I'm waiting for you in the comments, and I'll see you next time.